Hello, I am Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator, the camera's over here, and this is TeleInnovator, so my channel for self-education and polymathy. And speaking of polymathy, I've been working on this multidisciplinary spectrum. I've actually been working on it for a while, and I ended up finding these terms over the years that I felt all explained in some shape or form a multidisciplinary person, whether it's someone on the beginning ends where they're starting out and learning, or they're a universalist polymath and someone who's doing everything, like Leonardo da Vinci did. And so, regardless of where you fall on the scale, today we are talking about the gentleman scholar. Now, this particular term I feel kind of weird about because I feel like it shouldn't be on here, but I also feel like it should. And I was this close to maybe deleting it. I think I actually did delete another term because it just didn't have enough information on it, but it was one of those things where that term wasn't necessarily used in a multidisciplinary sense. It was used more in a religious sense, and so it didn't quite work out for what this term would be. And I think that with this one, it really does actually fit. It just is a matter of perspective, and I think it's a good tool for gaining perspective because gentlemen scholars in particular have kind of two meanings. So the first one is the gentleman scholar itself, and it's basically the idea that is everyone who is a gentleman scholar is pursuing education and learning and trying to be more intelligent, but in doing so, they're not actually doing anything with it. So think of the person who's in college for 10 years for their bachelor's degree. And I know people who are like that. I know they're trying hard. And for someone who doesn't have a degree, I'm not talking bad about them. But at some point, it's wise to think about, like, maybe I should stop and go do something else. Go learn a vocation or something like that, or learn blogging, or learn some new skill that you learn in a different way, because perhaps that way of learning isn't good for you. And having that level of self-awareness, I think, is key, because the whole idea of a gentleman scholar is that someone is doing too much in a negative way. They're being a dabbler, they're being a dilettante, they're learning without any action, and that's a negative. And I think that a lot of multidisciplinary people, which pretty much all multidisciplinary people in my experience that I've seen or learned about, they've all been self-learners. They've all been autodidacts, which means we have a penchant for learning a little much, right? And it may not be too much, but it is a point where, like, hey, we're spending more time learning than the general population. If not, like, maybe some of the specialists are too, but like deep specialists are the ones who are obsessed with that particular thing and they're learning. So the other definition, though, is a gentleman and a scholar. So it's kind of broken up a bit more. And I feel like they're basically one and the same, but I wanted to separate them in order to make it a little bit easier to wrap your head around. And so it's just more of a literal basis of the words a gentleman and a scholar, and it's hard to find any links for either definition, so that's why I split it up. A gentleman and a scholar is just someone with a good poise and elegance and being a gentleman, holding the door for somebody, having that chivalry aspect. And that was always what was very aimed for to attain for people of this generation. So this is like the founding fathers generation, where it's Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin kind of era. And I think it originated in UK, which makes more sense, honestly, like having that kind of knighthood mindset, but in a modern sense. And so I think that's kind of where that comes from. And the scholar part is someone who is learning. So there was an article I shared on the my article called Thomas Jefferson, Gentleman Scholar. And it talks about how even though he wasn't very intelligent, he was an intellectual in a way. Even though he's not quite the person we would see as an intelligent person, he was a learner, and he was voraciously reading, he was an autodidact, he was showing the traits of multidisciplinarity, and so I thought that was a key point to make. And so it's one of those things where the gentleman scholar is someone who's learning, who has poise, who's acting in that chivalrous manner, but it's also attainable by any gender per se. It's just a matter of it was the man who was around in that time that they were talking about. So how does this impact you? Well, that's why I made this post. That's why I put it in this series in the first place, is that I want people to be aware if they're doing something like that. Think of it like the term multipotentialite. There's a lot of people who would love that term, and I may anger some people. I one of my friends, great friends, Perry K, he talks about multipotentialites as a state of being, whereas I see it more as a stage. And so we disagree on that, but we are people who understand each other. And so when we talk about it, even though we disagree, we end up having a great conversation nonetheless because we respect one another. However, there are some people who would say the multi-potentialite is kind of a bad thing because, oh, you have the potential to do many things. It's kind of the same line of thinking as if the jack of all trades, master of none. So maybe we just need to stop being negative about it and just think about it as a potential. Think about it as a positive thing. Oh, you have the potential to do many things. Well, you should go do it. Encourage them. It's kind of like when someone new comes to the gaming scene and people who are really good might trash on that new gamer because they don't know the controls yet. But once that person learns the controls, they'll become good, they'll get better, they'll have practice. And so some of the more legacy gamers, people who have been around for a while, who actually know what to be a good person, will show the ways, show the ropes to the new people. And I try to be like that, but sometimes I might get angry if someone gets like stupid and runs off and gets killed or something like that. And it's one of those things where we have to have that patience as people who might be farther along on the spectrum or farther along on our own personal journeys, that someone with the potential to do many things, someone who's learning a lot. So perhaps a gentleman scholar could be a multi-potentialite, not the other way around per se, but someone who is a GS could be someone who's like, hey, I'm starting out, I want to learn, I'm going to learn a whole bunch before I do anything, and once they do something, that's the one problem about learning too, is that you never know what you don't know. And so you could read as many books as you want, but the problem you face down the line may not be in a book. And so that's kind of the problem about being a dilettante, where you may learn a lot, but if you don't practice it, you'll end up kind of still in the same spot down the line. There's only so much point of diminishing returns that you'll get. And I definitely learned this myself with like omni-channel content marketing. That's kind of something that's like, if you don't do it or you don't try to do it, you don't learn anything. This series itself, I had to change a few times with the first few episodes because it was one of those things where the way I was trying to do it was inefficient or at the very least unsustainable. And so I had to change it, even though I knew what I needed to do in some shape or form. And because of that unsustainability, I actually stopped making this for a while. And I'm going on this tangent because I think it's important, because I had learned so much about sharing content all over the place and creating the micro content and distributing it out, but I hadn't put it into practice as much yet. And so now that I have done that, I know a lot more about it, and I've been able to go on different shows and talk about it because I had learned from my mistakes. You can't learn from mistakes if you're just a dilettante. You're just learning for the sake of learning. And so you may have potential, but you won't have any practice yet. And so that is what this whole section of the blog post is about, is how it impacts you. Are you being a dilettante? Are you being someone with the potential to do many things, but not necessarily doing much anything with it? Even multi-potentialites do something with their stuff. They're playing around with things. They're experimenting. That's the difference between the GS and the multis, because the multis, at least in my opinion, are doing something. They're digging into their curiosities. They are exploring. Whereas gentlemen scholars are learning, but not purely exploring. And so you got to think about that, how we, as people who are more generalists, are having a negative opinion on gentlemen scholars. But that same line of thinking is what specialists think of generalists. Because the specialists think, oh, if you don't go deep enough, then you are not worthy. And that's kind of the problem, where, yes, I may only know 40% of knowledge in this area, but I know way more than a layperson. And so that's all that I need in order to do my work on this. And so compared to a specialist who knows twice as much, they might think you're just a dabbler. But compared to most people, you know more. And you're 40% in this area, but you also have 3 other areas that you're 40% in, or maybe 50 or 60, something like that. Depending on how long you live, like, those areas are going to get deeper and deeper, and you're going to have more and more. And so it's not about dabbling and putting your hands in all these cookie jars. It's about keep eating those cookies in those cookie jars. And instead of just chocolate chip like the specialist has, you have chocolate chip and peanut butter and red velvet and so forth, right? You have multiple kinds of cookies and you get to enjoy all of them. And that's kind of the difference there, where specialists have that negative mindset on generalists, but generalists have that same mindset on dilettantes. And that's because specialists think that generalists are dilettantes, even though we're not. And so I want you to identify when you are thinking like that, when you're having that negative bias, and try to overcome it and try to think in a different way. And so that's why I made this series, is so that way you could find a term you identify with. If you identify with multipotentialite, generalist, polymath, specialist, it doesn't matter. I want you to have that anchor. And so that way you don't have as much bias. It could induce more bias down the line, but it's more along the lines of opening yourself up rather than closing yourself off. And then finally, this last section here is more about the male population. Since this whole idea of a gentleman scholar is about men, I think it also could apply to ladyhood and that kind of thing too. But it's one of those things where it was an idea of becoming a better man. That was kind of the inspiration behind both terms, both definitions of the term, I mean. And so I wanted people to take that idea and try to become a better person themselves. So I actually tried to make myself a better person by learning from Aurelius or Seneca, but even modern YouTube channels like Alpha M and Charisma on Command, because those channels helped me identify charisma traits and body language and how to position myself. Even right now, I'm looking at the camera, making eye contact, and doing that in person too, and sitting there and listening when someone is speaking and trying to learn those skills. That is who I think a gentleman scholar of the modern era is, someone who's able to communicate, the world's most interesting man, if you will, like on Dos Equis. So I actually shared a post on there how I kind of perceive people of that modern, chivalrous, charismatic gentleman kind of manner. And I think that's probably the end of it for this episode. It's a bit of a shorter one, but I wanted to have that distinction. I wanted to have that discussion, even if it's just a small one, so that you can think about, are you being a dilettante, or are you just preparing yourself for the next phase of your life? I spend a lot of time learning, and sometimes that learning may not be worth it right now. But down the line, by sowing the seeds in the past, you have that plant already growing in your mind, right? I learned about forming an LLC way before I actually needed to. Maybe I needed it to around that time, but didn't realize it. But by learning back then, I knew that it was an important thing down the line. By learning about it, I was able to research it better down the line when I actually did need it. So I do think there's a point behind being a dilettante, because being a dilettante can be a temporary sensation. Alright, I'm going to stop going this tangent. I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and just think about if you're being biased in this moment.